The night sky above northern Arizona stretched endlessly, a black canvas pierced only by distant stars and the occasional headlight sweeping across the desert highway. At 11:47 p.m., the quiet hum inside the Flagstaff 911 dispatch center was shattered by the shrill ring of an incoming call. Dispatcher Kara Simmons leaned forward, pressing her headset tighter against her ear. She had handled overdoses, car wrecks, and domestic disputes in her 12 years on the night shift, but she knew instantly this wasn't one of those. The caller's voice was trembling, desperate, broken by shallow breaths. "Please, I need help. We're on Route 89, about 15 miles south of Page. My car's acting up." Kara's fingers began typing, logging location, time, and details. But her instincts told her this wasn't about a mechanical failure. The voice carried something sharper than worry. It was fear. "Ma'am, what's your name?" Kara asked, her voice steady calm. Laura Bennett. I'm with my daughter, Chloe." There was a pause, the sound of air rushing fast as if Laura had turned her head away from a phone. Then her voice returned lower, urgent. "Oh, God, he's still back there." Kara straightened in her chair. "Who's back there, Laura?" "The truck. Same one that's been following us since Tuba City. I think he's trying to run us off the road." And then, faint in the background, Kara heard it. The terrified voice of a girl, no older than 16. "Mom, he's speeding up. He's right behind us." The dispatcher felt her chest tighten. She immediately radioed highway units in the area, but the closest officer was still 20 miles away. "Laura, listen to me. I've got officers on the way. Can you see a mile marker? Any landmarks?" On the other end, the chaos grew louder. Tires screeching, an engine gunning, the phone rattling as if Laura's hand was shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to hit us." Laura's voice cracked. Please, hurry." The sound of an engine roared through the receiver, swallowing Laura's words. And then, suddenly, silence. The call cut off. "Laura? Hello? Can you hear me?" Kara tried, over and over. She dialed back. Once, twice, again. Nothing but the hollow, mocking ring of phone that would never be answered. The entire exchange lasted 47 seconds. Just 47 seconds, and then Laura Bennett, 43, and her daughter Chloe, 16, were gone. The next morning at 6:32 a.m., Arizona Highway Patrol Officer Daniel Ruiz received a call from a trucker who'd spotted a vehicle parked on the shoulder near mile marker 217. The hazard lights were still faintly blinking. Ruiz expected a routine breakdown. Instead, he found himself staring at a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his career. A silver Honda Civic sat neatly on the side of the road, keys still in the ignition. The car wasn't out of gas. The engine purred to life with a turn of the key. Laura's purse lay untouched on the passenger seat, wallet inside. $213 in cash unspent. Chloe's backpack was in the back seat, her prize Canon camera nestled inside as if she'd placed it there only moments earlier. Both of their phones were still plugged into the charger. Everything was in its place. Everything except them. Ruiz's eyes drifted to the dirt shoulder. That's when he saw them. Tire impressions, not from the Civic, but from something larger, heavier. A truck. The pattern showed it had been parked just behind Laura's car. And then came the prints. 2 sets of smaller footprints, leading away from the Civic toward where the truck had been. And alongside them, a larger set, deep, pressing hard into the dirt, like someone was dragging. Ruiz's pulse quickened. He knew what this meant. This wasn't a breakdown. This was an abduction. News of the disappearance spread quickly. A single mother and her teenage daughter, traveling to visit family in Nevada, swallowed whole by the desert in the span of one night. But to understand what really happened on Route 89 that November evening, investigators would have to dig far deeper than tire tracks and footprints. Because Laura and Chloe Bennett weren't just unlucky travelers who crossed paths with the wrong man. For weeks leading up to that night, someone had been watching them, studying them, leaving cryptic, terrifying messages that made Laura's skin crawl. And when the truth came out, years later, it wasn't the faceless stranger in the truck who shocked the world. It was someone much closer. Someone whose name Laura never spoke on that call. Someone who shared her blood. 3 days before the frantic 911 call, Laura Bennett sat hunched over a small kitchen table in Denver, her trembling hands clutching an envelope she had just pulled from her apartment mailbox. It was plain white, no return address. Her name was written in block letters across the front. Her heart sank. She already knew what was inside. Laura had received 5 of these letters in the past month. Always the same style. Typed words on crisp white paper, folded neatly into an envelope that appeared either tucked under her apartment door or slipped into her mailbox sometime during the night. The first one she tried to laugh off. I know Chloe leaves school at 3:05 p.m. I know you pick her up in the Silver Civic. I know you stop for gas on Tuesdays at the Conoco station. At the time, Laura assumed it was a prank. Maybe some creepy classmate of Chloe's trying to get under their skin. She filed a report with the Denver police, and the responding officer, Janet McCord, told her the same thing she probably told 100 nervous citizens before. There's no direct threat here. Keep the letters. Call us if it escalates. But it did escalate. The second letter mentioned Chloe specifically. She looked beautiful in the green sweater yesterday. She ate her sandwich alone. She didn't see me watching her. Laura didn't tell Chloe about that one. She stuffed it into a shoebox in her bedroom closet along with the first. But her sleep grew restless. Every creak of the old apartment building made her sit up in bed, heart hammering. By the time the 5th letter arrived, Laura had installed new locks, changed her daily routine, and insisted Chloe stay with friends after school whenever possible. That letter was only one chilling word. Soon. Now, as Laura slid this latest letter out of its envelope, her breath caught in her throat. I know you're leaving. I'll be there too. Chloe noticed a change in her mother even before she knew about the letters. Laura was always a cautious person, but now she was jumpy, twitchy, snapping at small noises. She triple-checked the locks at night and flinched every time headlights slowed near their building. Mom, you're scaring me, Chloe said one evening as she set her camera bag down on the couch. What's going on? Laura tried to brush it off at first. Work stress. Nothing you need to worry about. But Chloe wasn't stupid. She was 16 sharp and more observant than Laura gave her credit for. She'd seen the envelopes in the shoebox, caught the flicker of dread in her mother's eyes whenever she pulled the mail from their box. Finally, Laura told her. Not the details, just enough to make her understand why they needed to be careful. Someone's been sending me weird notes, Laura admitted one night, but it's probably nothing. Just someone trying to scare us. Notes? Like threatening notes. No, Laura lied too quickly. Not threatening. Just strange. But we're going to visit your Aunt Diane in Reno this weekend. A change of scenery will do us both good. Chloe wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe this was just her mom being overprotective. But that night, lying awake in her room, Chloe couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside their apartment door, sliding those letters inside, watching them, studying them. Friday evening came colder than expected. A biting wind sweeping down from the Rockies as Laura loaded their overnight bags into the Civic. Chloe's camera bag was the last thing she packed, slung carefully over her shoulder like armor. They left Denver just after 5:30 p.m., merging onto the interstate as dusk swallowed the city behind them. At first, the drive felt almost normal. They sang along to old playlists, snacked on chips, and argued over who got control of the music. But as the sun slipped below the horizon, Laura's paranoia returned. She kept checking the rearview mirror. Too often. At first, Chloe thought nothing of it. But then she noticed something. Her mother wasn't just glancing back occasionally. She was studying, watching, fixating on the headlights behind them. Mom, what is it? Chloe finally asked. Laura's hands tightened around the wheel. That truck. It's been behind us since the state line. Chloe turned in her seat. A dark pickup trailed them about 5 car lengths back. Nothing unusual about it, but the way her mom's voice wavered made Chloe's stomach clench. You think it's the same person? Laura didn't answer. She didn't have to. By the time they pulled into a gas station outside Tuba City at 9:10 p.m. Laura's nerves were fraying. She ushered Chloe inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder as she paid for gas and 2 Cokes. The clerk remembered later how tense she looked, how her eyes darted toward the glass windows every few seconds. Outside, a man stood beside a dark pickup at Pump 3. At one point, the clerk swore he saw him raise his phone toward the Civic, snapping photos. When Laura and Chloe emerged, the man slipped back into his truck and drove away. But he didn't drive far. What Laura never knew was that the notes, the carefully timed letters that had unraveled her peace of mind, hadn't come from some faceless stranger drifting through town. They came from someone with intimate knowledge of her life. Someone who knew her habits, her daughter's schedule, her every move. Someone who had been close to her family for years. The letters were not just warnings. They were instructions, a breadcrumb trail, guiding Laura and Chloe directly into the desert where he wanted them. And he was patient enough to wait until every piece of the plan was aligned. For now, Laura believed she was running from him, but in truth, she was driving straight toward him. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert with a pale, cold light. The mesas that loomed like ancient guardians were bathed in pink and gold, but the highway cutting to them felt untouched by beauty. Mile after mile of asphalt stretched across emptiness, silent except for the occasional truck roaring past. It was on this road, Route 89, that trucker Mark Ellison noticed the silver Honda Civic. He had seen it the night before, hazard lights blinking faintly as he pushed north toward Page. Now, nearly 8 hours later, the car hadn't moved. Something about that unsettled him. He slowed his rig, pulling onto the shoulder. The Civic sat neatly aligned with the road, as if parked deliberately, not abandoned in haste. Ellison climbed down, boots crunching against gravel, and approached the vehicle. The sight made his stomach twist. The driver's side door was closed. The keys dangled from the ignition. A purse lay on the passenger seat, strap curled neatly as if set down gently. Behind it, a backpack with a bright yellow keychain dangled from the zipper. Ellison knocked on the glass, calling out. No movement. He tugged on the handle. Unlocked. The door swung open with a creak. Hello. The car was empty. No sign of a struggle, no blood. But the air inside carried a faint, unsettling smell. Something chemical, sharp, almost metallic. Ellison backed away and pulled out his phone. Yeah, dispatch? You better send someone out here. This ain't right. Arizona Highway Patrol Officer Daniel Ruiz arrived 20 minutes later. He was 32, sharp-eyed, and not easily rattled. But even he felt unease when he saw the Civic's interior. Everything was too intact. Victims of roadside violence usually left chaos behind. Broken glass, torn clothing, signs of a struggle. But here, everything sat in quiet order, like the Bennetts had simply stepped out and never returned. Ruiz examined the ground. That's when he found the tire tracks. Parallel to the Civic's own, another set of tread marks gouged the dirt shoulder. They belonged to a much larger vehicle, likely a pickup. The soil was deeply pressed, suggesting the truck had been parked for some time. And then the footprints. 2 smaller sets, light and close together, leading from the Civic toward where the truck had been. Chloe's and Laura's. He thought immediately. Alongside them, a heavier set. Each print sunk deeper into the dirt, and some of those deeper impressions overlapped with Laura's and Chloe's, smudging their paths, dragging their direction. Ruiz's throat tightened. He radioed in backup. This wasn't a simple breakdown. This was abduction. By noon, the Civic had been cordoned off with bright yellow tape. Detectives from Coconino County arrived, dusting the interior for prints, snapping photos of every angle. News vans swarmed the scene soon after. The story was irresistible. A single mother and her teenage daughter vanished without a trace in the middle of the desert. Reporters latched onto the 911 call almost immediately. The recording leaked within hours. Laura's terrified voice replayed across television screens and local radio stations. He's still back there. They're going to hit us. The public ate it up. The faceless predator. The chase. The sudden silence. But while headlines painted the story as a random highway nightmare, investigators found themselves faced with contradictions. If this was a highway predator, Why leave the Civic untouched? Why not take valuables? Why remove both women without struggle? Detective Harper Lang, a 20-year veteran of missing persons, crouched beside the tire impressions late that afternoon. She studied the shape of the tread, her hand hovering over the grooves like she could read them. This wasn't some stranger who pulled over and happened to see them, she muttered. He was waiting, watching. He wanted both of them alive. The Bennett's apartment in Denver was searched the next day. Chloe's friend described her as bright, artistic, and obsessed with photography. None of them could think of anyone who'd want to hurt her. Laura's co-workers painted her as cautious, but kind, the type who baked extra cookies to bring to the office. But inside the apartment, detectives found what the media hadn't yet discovered: the shoebox, tucked deep in Laura's closet. It held the stack of letters she had been hiding, each one folded neatly, each one typed in the same cold font. Investigators spread them across the kitchen table. I know Chloe leaves school at 3:05. She looked beautiful in the green sweater yesterday. Soon. I know you're leaving. I'll be there too. Detective Lang's hands trembled slightly as she read them. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. Whoever had taken Laura and Chloe had been stalking them for weeks, maybe months. But the strangest part? The envelopes bore no postmark. They hadn't been mailed. They had been hand-delivered, which meant the stalker lived close. Very close. Meanwhile, the Civic was towed to the forensics garage in Flagstaff. Under ultraviolet light, investigators discovered faint residue on the back seat, a chemical smear invisible to the naked eye. The lab techs identified it as chloroform. The implication was chilling. Whoever took Laura and Chloe hadn't simply threatened them into compliance. He had prepared. He had planned to knock them unconscious, transport them, and disappear without chaos. This wasn't the work of an impulsive predator. This was someone meticulous, someone patient, someone who knew exactly what he wanted. In Denver, Chloe's best friend Maya Torres broke down during her interview. She revealed something Laura had never told police. A week before the trip, Chloe confided that she thought someone had been following her home from school. She said it was this old brown pickup, Maya whispered. She thought it was the same one parked down the street from her building a couple of nights. Detectives exchanged uneasy looks. The description matched the tread marks from Route 89. The Bennett disappearance dominated headlines for weeks. Candlelight vigils were held in Denver. Tips poured in from across Arizona and Nevada, but none panned out. The Civic became an eerie symbol, a car that waited patiently in the desert, while its passengers were swallowed whole. But behind the noise, investigators began piecing together a profile. This wasn't random. It wasn't reckless. Whoever was behind it had targeted Laura and Chloe specifically. He wanted control. He wanted them alive. And the one truth no one dared to voice out loud, not to the public, not even each other, was this: people don't plan like that unless they've been close to the family all along. Someone who knew Laura, someone who knew Chloe, and someone who wasn't finished yet. The first 48 hours after a disappearance are everything. That's what Detective Harper Lang reminded herself as she stared at the evidence board in the Coconino County Command Post. Photos of Laura and Chloe Bennett smiled back at her, pinned beside images of their Civic, the tire impressions, and photocopies of the threatening letters. Every lead mattered. Every possibility had to be chased. And at first, all signs pointed outward, toward strangers, drifters, and the lonely stretch of Route 89 itself. The initial suspect pool was obvious: truckers. The desert highway was a lifeline for cross-country haulers, and countless cases had tied predators to the long-haul routes. Investigators canvassed truck stops from Flagstaff to Kanab, showing photos of Laura and Chloe, asking if anyone had seen a silver Civic or a woman and girl matching their description. Some remembered the hazard lights flashing. A few even recalled seeing a dark pickup tailing them near Tuba City. But no one could give a plate number. No one could say where it went. One man swore he'd seen Chloe at a rest stop bathroom near the Utah border just after midnight. But security footage proved the girl he'd noticed was someone else entirely. Another lead dead-ended. Back in Denver, suspicion turned inward. The letters made clear this wasn't random. Someone close to Laura had stalked her. which meant the first question detectives had to ask was the ugliest. What about Chloe's father? Gregory Bennett, Laura's ex-husband, lived across town with a new partner. He had a history of arguments with Laura, especially over custody arrangements. Neighbors remembered Ray's voices in the parking lot months earlier. Gregory was brought in for questioning on the third day. His reaction was immediate, rage mixed with grief. You think I'd do this? You think I'd hurt my daughter? He slammed his fist against the table, his face pale with fury. I may not get along with Laura, but Chloe is my kid. You think I'm capable of this? Detective Lang watched him carefully. Anger didn't equal guilt, but it didn't clear him either. Where were you on the night of October 14th? She asked calmly. Gregory's alibi was solid. He'd been working a late shift at the auto shop where his boss and 3 co-workers vouched for him. Security footage from the shop's cameras confirmed his story. Still, the media clung to his name, whispering about the bitter divorce, the custody disputes, the resentment. In the public's imagination, Gregory became the easy villain. But behind closed doors, Lang crossed his photo off her board. He's not our guy, she muttered. Next came the neighbors. A man across the hall from Laura's apartment admitted he'd noticed her often, maybe too often. His story about when he last saw her didn't line up with his work schedule. For a week, he was their prime focus. His computer was seized, his apartment searched. But nothing connected him to the Civic, the letters, or the desert highway. Just another dead end. As the days stretched into weeks, the Bennett case began to take on a haunting weight. Candlelight vigils were held in Denver. Chloe's classmates wept openly on camera, holding posters with her face. Laura's co-workers describe her as a devoted mother who never missed a chance to brag about her daughter's photography. And still, no one knew where they were. The Civic became a roadside shrine. Flowers, stuffed animals, and crosses were left against the guardrail where the car had been found. Truckers honked their horns as they passed, a ritual salute to the women who had vanished into the desert air. But inside the command post, the tone was darker. Every failed lead drained morale. Every day without answers made the chances of recovery slimmer. And yet, Lang couldn't shake one detail. The letters. They weren't written by some transient predator. The phrasing was too specific, too personal. The detail about Chloe's green sweater. The note about the Conoco station. Whoever wrote them knew the Bennett's routines intimately. This isn't some guy living out his truck, Lang said one evening, slamming a hand against the board. This is someone who's been watching for months. Someone in their circle. We're wasting time looking at strangers. Her theory gained weight after the FBI's behavioral unit reviewed the case. The profiler's conclusion chilled the room. These letters show organized thinking. A planner. Someone patient, deliberate, and emotionally invested in the victims. This isn't an opportunist. This is someone with a personal tie to the family. Lang stared at the words. Personal tie. The obvious candidate, Gregory, was cleared. The neighbors led nowhere. Friends, co-workers, and Chloe's classmates were being vetted. But there was one name conspicuously absent from the suspect pool. Someone who had remained a shadow figure in the background of the investigation. Charles Whitaker, Laura's father, Chloe's grandfather. He hadn't been in Denver when Laura disappeared. He lived 2 states away in rural New Mexico, where he kept a small ranch. At least, that's what everyone thought. His name hadn't come up much. He was described as distant, strict, and private. He and Laura had a strained relationship after years of disagreements. And yet, as Lang flipped through the case notes, she noticed something odd. Charles had not once contacted police to ask about his daughter or granddaughter. No phone calls. No statements. No pleas. Nothing. It was as if the disappearance of his only child and grandchild hadn't touched him at all. Meanwhile, the desert kept its silence. Search parties scoured the mesas and canyons. Helicopters slicing across the horizon. Volunteers on ATVs combed dry creek beds. Dogs picked up faint trails near the Civic, but lost them in the rocky terrain. Every trace ended in nothingness. The highway that swallowed Laura and Chloe gave nothing back. Not yet. By the end of the 3rd week, The Bennett disappearance had become both a public obsession and a private torment for investigators. Theories multiplied. A cartel abduction, a serial predator, a cult operating in the desert. But Detective Lang, staring at her board late into the night, kept circling back to one possibility. The letters, the pickup, the level of planning. It didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like family. And somewhere out there, someone who shared their blood was holding on to a secret darker than anyone could imagine. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain. But for the families of the missing, the wound never closes. It simply scabs over, tender beneath the surface, waiting for the day it tears open again. For Laura Bennett's family, the years after her and Chloe's disappearance were defined by silence. Vigils turned into anniversaries. Anniversaries into memorials without bodies. Chloe's friends graduated, went to college, started families of their own. Her empty desk in the yearbook became a quiet reminder of how easily a life can be stolen. The shrine along Route 89 grew weathered. Crosses faded in the Arizona sun. Teddy bears shriveled, their fur stiff with desert dust. The guardrail still bore the faint scratches from Laura's Civic, but few stopped there anymore. The desert had reclaimed its mystery. By 2015, the Bennett case had become one more unsolved file in a police archive. Its evidence box pushed to the back of a storage room. Detective Harper Lang had long since transferred to another division, but she carried the case with her like a shadow she couldn't shake. On bad nights, she still heard the sound of Laura's broken 911 call echoing in her head. 47 seconds of terror that ended with silence. And then, in the summer of 2023, the silence finally cracked. His name was Ethan Clark, a 34-year-old software engineer from Phoenix who loved camping alone in remote corners of the state. On a scorching July evening, he pulled his pickup onto a forgotten dirt road that veered away from Route 89, about 20 miles south of Page. The land there was brutal red rock cliffs, gullies that swallowed the sun, and emptiness so vast it hummed in your ears. Perfect for isolation, perfect for secrets. Ethan set up his tent at the edge of a dry arroyo. As night fell, he wandered with his flashlight, scanning for firewood. That's when he saw it. Half buried under a tangle of sagebrush, a piece of weathered fabric sticking up through the sand. At first, he thought it was trash. But when he tugged at it, the earth gave way, and what he uncovered made his stomach lurch. It was a shoe, small, faded pink, a child's size. His light swept wider, revealing more scraps of fabric, brittle with age. And then bones. Human bones. Ethan staggered back, heart hammering, fumbling for his phone. His 911 call was panicked, barely coherent, but the words that mattered came through. "I think I found them." By dawn, the arroyo was crawling with law enforcement. Detective Lang, now in her 50s, drove through the night the moment she heard. 13 years had passed, but the Bennett case had never left her. She stood at the edge of the excavation site, desert wind snapping at the brim of her hat, as forensic teams unearthed the remains. 2 sets of bones, one smaller, one larger. Beside them, remnants of clothing, a woman's blouse, a child's sweater in faded green. It was them. Laura and Chloe had been here all along, swallowed by the desert just miles from where the Civic was found. Lang's throat tightened as she knelt beside the grave. For years, she had imagined finding them, alive, hidden, waiting to be rescued. This was not rescue. This was recovery. But recovery came with answers, and answers could lead to justice. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had long feared. Laura and Chloe had died the night they vanished. The bones told a brutal story, fracture consistent with blunt force trauma. Chloe's wrists showed signs of being bound. Laura's ribs bore marks that spoke of struggle. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the desert. It was murder. And near the shallow grave, detectives uncovered something else. Buried in the sand, rusted but unmistakable, was a piece of a vehicle, an emblem from a Ford pickup. Not just any pickup, a model from the late 1990s. The same kind of truck witnesses had described tailing Laura's Civic that night. The case was alive again. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. For the first time in over a decade, Laura and Chloe's names were on every headline. Old footage of vigils and interviews replayed on TV. People who had long forgotten suddenly remembered. Gregory Bennett, older now, gray in his beard, wept openly on camera. I knew they were gone, but part of me still hoped. I still hoped. The public outpouring was immense. But beneath the grief, suspicion resurfaced. Who had driven that truck? And why, for 13 years, had the desert held their secret so close? Detective Lang revisited the case files with renewed fury. Every suspect was reevaluated. Every lead reexamined. The neighbor across the hall? Still clean. The trucker's sightings? Too vague. Gregory? His alibi still ironclad. But there, in the dusty corner of the file, was a name she had circled all those years ago. Charles Whitaker, the estranged father, the grandfather who had never once called for updates, the man who had slipped through the cracks because he was family, because no one wanted to believe. Now, with 2 graves unearthed and a Ford emblem in hand, Lang found herself asking the question she had buried long ago. What if the predator had been family all along? The desert had given up its dead, but the real horror was only beginning to surface. When the desert gave up Laura and Chloe's remains, grief swept through Denver like a storm. Candles were lit again. Vigils reignited. But this time, there was no illusion of hope. This was final. The Bennett family gathered for a memorial service at a small church outside the city. Chloe's classmates, grown now, some with children of their own, returned, holding flowers and photographs. Gregory sat in the front row, shoulders bowed, his hands trembling. But one chair remained conspicuously empty. Charles Whitaker never came. For detectives, the absence screamed louder than words. It wasn't just that Charles stayed away from vigils. He hadn't so much as picked up a phone when the discovery was announced. Not to the police, not to the press, not even to Gregory. Lang remembered the old case notes. Laura had spoken little of her father, except to say their relationship was strained. Strained how? She hadn't elaborated. It was the kind of gap that investigators often overlooked in the chaos of an active case. But now, with the graves uncovered, Lang saw it for what it was, a hole that demanded filling. She drove to New Mexico, where Charles still lived on a small, crumbling ranch outside Farmington. The place looked frozen in time, paint peeling, fences sagging, rust bleeding from an old barn. And there, parked under a lean-to shed, was a truck, a Ford, late 1990s model. Its once red paint had dulled to the color of dried blood, its bed lined with dents and scars. The sight made Lang's chest tighten. It was too close, too perfect. Charles stepped out from the porch as she approached. He was in his 70s now, hair white, skin like parchment, but his frame was still broad. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp for a man his age. "You've got no right coming here," he barked before she could even introduce herself. Lang kept her voice calm. "We're re-examining the Bennett case. I need to ask a few questions." His jaw tightened. "That case is closed. My daughter, my granddaughter, they're gone. Isn't that enough for you?" Lang studied him. The words were right, but the tone, cold, almost rehearsed, was all wrong. Back in Denver, she dug deeper into his past. What emerged painted a darker picture than anyone expected. Charles had once been a respected rancher, but neighbors described him as strict, controlling, a man whose temper could flare like lightning. "You didn't cross Charles Whitaker," one said, "and if you did, you regretted it." Laura's childhood was marked by those storms. Records from child services hinted at visits to the home decades earlier, complaints about verbal and physical discipline. Nothing ever proven, nothing that led to charges. But the whispers lingered. And then there was the estrangement. Laura had cut ties almost completely after Chloe was born. Friends said she wanted to raise her daughter free of her father's shadow. But blood ties, no matter how severed, run deep. And investigators began to ask the unthinkable. Had Charles tried to reclaim control of the family he believed he still owned? Forensic teams examined the Ford on Charles's ranch. It had been repainted at some point, patches of primer visible beneath the faded red. The VIN confirmed it was a 1998 F-150, exactly the type linked to Laura's disappearance. When investigators requested to tow it for further testing, Charles exploded. "That truck's mine. You've got no cause to touch it." But the warrant went through. Inside the wheel wells, forensic technicians found what they had feared and expected: traces of fabric fibers, decades old, too degraded to match conclusively but suggestive enough to raise alarms. And in the glove box, folded carefully as if preserved, was an old photo, Laura as a young woman, holding toddler Chloe, smiling, unaware of the storm behind a camera lens. Detectives pressed Charles again, this time in an interview room instead of his porch. "Where were you the night of October 14, 2010? "I was home," he answered flatly. "Anyone who can confirm that." Silence. His hands remained steady, but his eyes flickered just enough for Lang to notice. This was a man who thought he could outlast questions simply by refusing to answer them. But the walls were closing in. Gregory was brought in again, this time not as a suspect, but as a witness. The mention of Charles's name made his expression harden. "He never liked me," Gregory said. "Thought I wasn't good enough for Laura. But it wasn't just me. He didn't like anyone near her. He wanted control. Always did." Gregory leaned forward, voice dropping. "You think he had something to do with this, don't you? You think he killed his own daughter and granddaughter?" Lang didn't answer, but the silence was enough. As whispers of Charles's involvement began to spread, the family fractured further. Some refused to believe. "He's an old man," Laura's sister insisted. "He couldn't have done something like this." But others weren't so sure. Old memories resurfaced. Nights of shouting, slammed doors, Laura arriving at relatives' houses in tears. The idea was horrifying, unthinkable. Yet it explained what nothing else had. Why Laura sounded so terrified on that 911 call. Why the letters stopped when she vanished. Why Charles never showed his face at vigils. The predator hadn't been a stranger on the highway. He had been at the head of their own family table. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. The truck fibers, the estrangement, the absence at vigils, none of it would survive in court without more. Detectives needed a breakthrough, something tangible. And in a cruel twist of fate, that breakthrough would come not from police work, but from a discovery buried deep in Charles's ranch. Something that had been waiting, like the desert graves, to tell its story. The warrant for Charles Whitaker's ranch came through on a blistering August morning. A convoy of unmarked vehicles rumbled up the dirt path, tires spitting dust into the already sweltering air. From his porch, Charles watched them approach, arms folded, jaw tight. He didn't shout this time. He didn't wave them off. He simply sat there, still as stone, as if daring them to find anything at all. Detective Lang didn't rise to the challenge. She nodded to her team, and the search began. The property stretched for acres, sagging barns, rusted tractors, fields where weeds had long since won the war against crops. At first glance, it looked ordinary but hollow, like a place that carried memories too heavy for its soil. Inside the barn, dust hung in the air like fog. Old saddles, broken tools, boxes of forgotten belongings cluttered every corner. Yet it wasn't the obvious that caught Lang's attention. It was the smell. Not fresh, not rot. Something faint, metallic, seeping from beneath the boards. "Pull this up," she ordered. Crowbars pried at the warped planks. Nails shrieked loose. And underneath, in a shallow pit, lay what no one wanted to see. A tarp, wrapped tight. The air thickened as gloves pulled it free. When the plastic unfurled, silence consumed the barn. Inside were clothes. Women's clothes. Folded but stained, brittle with time. And on top of the bundle, like a grotesque crown, sat a lock of chestnut hair, tied with a faded green ribbon. Lang's stomach dropped. Chloe's ribbon. The same one she had worn in school photos. The search widened. Behind the barn, near a collapsed fence, a cadavered dog alerted. The earth was disturbed, subtle, but different from the rest of the yard. Shovels bit into the dirt. 2 feet down, they struck metal. It was a rusted oil drum, sealed shut. The lid groaned as it was pried off, the smell hitting like a physical blow. Inside, cushioned in layers of rotted fabric and sand, were remnants investigators couldn't mistake. A hammer, heavy, its handle wrapped in old electrical tape. Dried, dark stains still clung to the steel. And beside it, a set of restraints, nylon rope frayed at the ends, tied in knots that matched the marks found on Chloe's wrist bones. The silence was suffocating. Lang stepped back, fighting the bile in her throat. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was the past, clawing its way out of the dirt to tell its story. News of the discovery shattered what was left of the Bennett family's fragile hope for answers without betrayal. Gregory was called in, shown the photographs, his face drained of color. He kept this? Gregory whispered, staring at the ribbon. His hands trembled, as if holding the image itself could poison him. He kept this? Lang didn't answer. She didn't need to. For Gregory, the realization was a second death. Not only had he lost his wife and daughter, but now he knew beyond denial, that the monster who took them shared their bloodline. When detectives returned to confront Charles, he sat in his living room, TV flickering silently in the background. He didn't rise, didn't protest. "You buried evidence," Lang said, her voice cold. Charles chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Evidence," he repeated, as though the word itself were a joke. "Laura cut you out of her life," Lang pressed. "You couldn't stand it. You followed her that night. You forced her off the road." His eyes flicked up, glinting sharp despite the years. For a moment, Lang thought she saw pride there. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't know what you think you found," Charles said flatly, "but nothing brings them back." Back at the station, the evidence was cataloged piece by piece. The hammer's stains were tested. After 13 years, DNA was degraded, but traces consistent with human blood remained. The fibers pulled from the truck's wheel wells aligned with fragments of Laura's blouse. And the ribbon, carefully preserved in photos, matched perfectly with images of Chloe in her school records. The case was no longer cold. It burned red hot. Yet even as the net closed, Charles Whitaker refused to bend. No confession, no remorse, only silence where grief should have been, and disdain where love should have lived. The discovery at the ranch made headlines. But for those closest to Laura and Chloe, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like betrayal sharpened to a blade. Family members spoke out, some in disbelief, others in rage. He was supposed to protect them. Laura's sister said through tears. He was their grandfather. How do you reconcile that? Gregory didn't appear on camera. He couldn't. Friends said he barely spoke. His home turned into a shrine of photographs, as if he could hold on to Laura and Chloe in a world where trust had been poisoned forever. And still, the question lingered. Why? Why would a man murder his own daughter and granddaughter? Detective Lang asked herself that every night, staring at the evidence spread across her desk. The hammer, the rope, the ribbon, objects that should have been meaningless, but in Charles's hands had become symbols of something darker. Control, possession, a need so warped it destroyed the very family he was meant to cherish. But motive was only half the story, because somewhere hidden deeper still was the full truth of what happened that night, a truth only Charles could speak. And the question was, would he ever break his silence? The walls of the Denver County Jail were thick, but they couldn't silence the storm swirling outside. Reporters camped on sidewalks. Headlines screamed betrayal. The story of a grandfather turned suspect in the disappearance and likely murder of his own daughter and granddaughter was too chilling, too tragic, to ignore. Inside, Charles Whitaker sat across from Detective Lang in a sterile interview room. His wrists were cuffed, his posture rigid. He wasn't broken. Not yet. Lang studied him, patient, controlled. She had seen men like him before, men who thrived on silence, on power withheld. To them, not speaking was its own kind of weapon. Your daughter's clothes. Lang began softly, sliding photos across the table. Your granddaughter's ribbon. We found them under your barn. Charles's eyes flicked to the photographs. No flinch, no flicker of grief. Only that same blank, glacial stare. Lang leaned forward. Why keep them, Charles? Why hide them all these years? He said nothing. Forensic evidence was stacking higher by the day, but the case still lacked the one thing prosecutors knew could bury him: a confession. So Lang and her team turned to psychology. They dug through Charles's history, piecing together the fragments of a man who had built his life around control. Interviews with old neighbors painted a portrait of a patriarch whose authority was absolute. His word was law, his punishment swift. Laura had been his only daughter. For years, she lived under his thumb, until the birth of Chloe gave her reason to break away. Friends said Charles hated Gregory, despised that Laura had chosen independence over obedience. He didn't lose a daughter, one neighbor recalled. He lost ownership. And Charles, he wasn't the kind of man who accepted that. Back in the interrogation room, Lang shifted tactics. "You know," she said, voice calm, "Laura told friends she left because she didn't want Chloe to grow up under your shadow. She didn't want her daughter to fear you the way she did." For the first time, a twitch, subtle, but there. Charles's jaw tightened. Lang pressed harder. "Is that why you followed them that night? Because Laura was slipping away? Because Chloe was a reminder you couldn't control them anymore?" Charles's lips parted slightly, as though words were forming, but then he clamped shut again. His silence was his fortress. But Lang knew fortresses crumble when the foundation cracks. And she had just struck one. Meanwhile, the family outside fractured further. Some relatives refused to believe it. "He's an old man," Laura's aunt insisted to a local reporter. "This is madness. They've got it wrong." But others couldn't ignore the evidence. Laura's cousin spoke quietly at a vigil. "We always knew something wasn't right. The way he looked at her, like she was his possession, not his child. His possession. And Gregory, already a hollow version of the man he once was, spiraled deeper into despair. Friends described him as haunted, barely eating, barely speaking. The knowledge that Laura and Chloe had been betrayed by family, not strangers, seemed to drain what little fight he had left. "He blames himself," one friend said. "He thinks if he'd taken a different road that night, if he'd argued less with Laura about the trip, maybe they wouldn't have crossed paths with Charles at all." But guilt was a burden Gregory could never lay down. Detectives returned to the ranch, combing through every inch of soil, every hidden corner. What they found added weight to the growing case. Beneath a loose floorboard in Charles's bedroom, tucked away in a cigar box, were more photographs. Some were decades old, Laura as a child, smiling awkwardly at a birthday party. But others were more sinister. One showed Laura as an adult, standing in her kitchen, clearly unaware she was being photographed through a window. Another captured Chloe leaving school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The implication was unmistakable. Charles had been watching them. The evidence painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. Charles hadn't snapped in a sudden fit of rage that October night. He had stalked them, planned, waited, and when he finally acted, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical. The barn, the oil drum, the photographs. They weren't the mistakes of a desperate man. They were the trophies of someone who believed he had reclaimed what was his. Still, in court, evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Prosecutors needed motive spelled out. They needed Charles's own words to pierce the veil of silence. So Lang returned once more. She placed the photos of Chloe on the table. She was 16, Charles. 16. You were supposed to protect her, not bury her. His breathing deepened, nostrils flaring. For a moment, his mask cracked. Lang leaned in. You can sit here in silence. But the world already knows. Your family knows. And when the jury sees these photos, when they hear about the ribbon you kept, your silence won't protect you. It will bury you. Charles's lips curved, just slightly, into what might have been a smile. Then he spoke, voice gravelly, almost a whisper. They were mine. Lang froze. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of years. A claim, a confession, a curse. Charles leaned back, the smile gone, the silence slamming back into place. But the damage was done. The fortress had cracked wide open. Outside the room, Lang replayed those words in her head again and again. They were mine. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to reveal the truth she already feared. This wasn't just murder. It was obsession. And the shadow Charles Whitaker cast over his family had grown darker than anyone ever imagined. The courthouse in Coconino County had never seen crowds like this. On the morning of Charles Whitaker's arraignment, the steps were flooded. Reporters clutching microphones, photographers jostling for the perfect shot, townsfolk whispering in disbelief. It wasn't every day that a man accused of killing his own daughter and granddaughter was led in chains through the lobby. Charles shuffled forward, flanked by deputies. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his wiry frame, but his expression hadn't changed. No sorrow, no fear, just that same cold vacancy, as if he were the only one in the room who truly understood the ending of the story. Inside the courtroom, tension buzzed like static. Prosecutor Rachel Navarro opened with words that sliced through the hush. "This is not a story of a random predator," she told the jury. "It is a story of a father and grandfather who believed his family was property to be owned, and when they slipped beyond his control, he ensured they slipped out of existence." She laid out the roadmap, the 911 call, the abandoned car, the evidence pulled from a ranch, the ribbon, the hammer, the photographs. Objects that spoke louder than words ever could. The defense countered with desperation. Attorney Mark Heller painted Charles as a frail old man, incapable of such acts. "The state has no bodies," he reminded the jury. "No direct eyewitnesses. They have speculation built on coincidences." He gestured toward Charles. "This man is 80 years old. He lost his daughter and granddaughter. And instead of sympathy, the state gives him shackles." But even as he spoke, it was clear his words barely stirred the jury. The photographs, the ribbon, they lingered in everyone's minds, poised in the air with unease. Witness after witness took the stand. Kara Simmons, the dispatcher who had answered Laura's call, recounted those final frantic moments. The fear in Chloe's voice, the revving engine, the abrupt silence. Her testimony left the courtroom frozen, every juror picturing that lonely stretch of Route 89. Next came forensic experts, detailing the fibers, the DNA traces, the peculiar knots in the rope that matched injuries on the skeletal remains found near the oil drum. They spoke clinically, but the words landed like blows. And then the photographs. Projected on a screen, they flickered to the courtroom like ghosts. Chloe leaving school, Laura in her kitchen, candid and unaware. The images twisted the room's stomach. "These weren't keepsakes," Navarro said sharply. "These were trophies, proof of control." But the heaviest testimony came from Laura Bennett. When he took the stand, his shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight. His voice shook as he described years of tension with Charles, the way Laura had pulled away from her father to shield Chloe. "He didn't just lose them," Gregory said, eyes fixed on the jury. "He hunted them. He stalked them. And I didn't see it until it was too late." His words cracked mid-sentence, the grief raw even after 13 years. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some dabbing at their eyes. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a father's anguish, laid bare. Through it all, Charles sat silent. When the ribbon was held up, he stared straight ahead. When Gregory sobbed on the stand, his expression never shifted. When Navarro repeated his own whispered words, "They were mine," Charles's lips curled ever so slightly, as if savoring the memory. The absence of remorse was louder than any denial could have been. As closing arguments approached, Navarro stood tall before the jury. "You've heard the silence," she said. "You've seen the photographs. You felt the weight of a father and grandfather who looked at his family not as people to love, but possessions to control. Laura and Chloe tried to escape, and Charles Whitaker made sure they never would." She paused, letting the words sink. "This trial is not just about punishment. It is about giving Laura and Chloe back their voices. Voices silenced on a dark Arizona road 13 years ago." The defense clung to their final plea. "No confession," Heller argued. "No direct proof. You cannot convict a man based on eerie coincidences and emotion. Sympathy is not evidence. Assumptions are not justice." But his words hung weakly in the air. The jury had seen too much, felt too much. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into tense silence. Hours stretched into a day. Families held vigils outside, candles flickering in the desert wind. Inside, the jurors wrestled with questions of proof, doubt, and the chilling possibility of convicting without bodies. But in the end, the evidence outweighed the shadows. The ribbon, the hammer, the oil drum, the photographs, and Charles's own words. They were mine. On the second day, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman rose, voice steady, delivering the verdict that sealed history. Guilty, on all counts. A gasp rippled through the room. Gregory buried his face in his hands. Laura's sister clutched a photograph of Chloe, whispering, "Justice." But across the aisle, Charles only leaned back in his chair, chains clinking softly. His face remained unreadable, except for the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. As if justice had meant nothing at all. The gavel struck. Sentencing was set for the following month. But for the family, for the town, for everyone who had followed the case, it was already clear. The trial had given Laura and Chloe back their voices, but it could never give them back their lives. And Charles Whitaker, father, grandfather, betrayer, would carry the truth of that silence into the grave. The verdict reverberated across Arizona like thunder rolling through the desert canyons. Guilty, on all counts. For weeks after, newspapers ran the same grainy mugshot of Charles Whitaker, his eyes sunken, his face unmoved, as though the world was still struggling to reconcile the image of a grandfather with the shadow of a killer. But for the Bennett family, justice was not the same as peace. On sentencing day, the courtroom was quieter than it had been during the trial. The reporters were still there, but fewer. The frenzy had ebbed, leaving behind only the grief-stricken core of those who had loved Laura and Chloe. Gregory Bennett sat in the front row, his hands clasped, his face gaunt. He had aged 20 years and 13, and now every wrinkle seemed carved with regret. He wore the same tie Laura had bought him for their 10th anniversary, the silk frayed at the edges. When Charles was led into the courtroom, the chains at his ankles rattled faintly. He took his seat at the defense table, leaning back with the air of someone attending a casual meeting rather than a sentencing for double murder. Judge Avery looked down from the bench, her voice steady. "Charles Whitaker, you stand convicted of the murder of your daughter, Laura Bennett, and your granddaughter, Chloe Bennett. The crimes were deliberate, calculated, and carried out with cruelty beyond comprehension. You showed no remorse. Accordingly, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck once. Final. Gasps echoed. Some cried. Others sat frozen. But Charles almost smiled. In prison, he was a ghost among men. Inmates whispered about him but kept their distance. Guards described him as quiet, watchful, unsettling. He rarely spoke, except to mutter scripture under his breath, though never the verses about love or forgiveness. Always the ones about obedience, authority, dominion. One guard recalled him saying, almost proudly, "They were mine until the end." It was the same chilling refrain Detective Lang had pried out of him years before. Outside the prison walls, Gregory tried to piece together a life that no longer felt like his. He moved out of the house he had shared with Laura, unable to bear the sight of her handwriting on recipe cards, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway. He kept Chloe's bedroom untouched, the posters still pinned, the textbooks still stacked on her desk. Neighbors described him as a man lost in memory, wandering through routines without direction. He was there, one said, but not really living anymore. Even as Charles rotted in a cell, Gregory felt like the true sentence had been handed to him. Detective Lang carried the case with her, too. In interviews years later, she admitted that it was the silence that haunted her most. "Most suspects break eventually," she said. "They cry, they beg, they curse. But Charles, he stayed calm, like he had already made peace with what he'd done, like he believed it was his right." When asked if she believed there was more to the story, more victims, more secrets buried beneath the soil of that ranch, Lang only looked away. "We'll never really know," she said. "That's the price of his silence." 2 years after his sentencing, Charles died quietly in his prison bunk. No struggle, no note, just a hollow shell of man who had carried his darkness to the grave. Some family members refused to attend the burial. "He's already taken too much from us," Laura's cousin said. "He doesn't deserve our tears." But Gregory went. He stood alone at the edge of the gravesite, staring at the casket as it lowered into the dirt. He said nothing, only clutching the photo of Laura and Chloe he had carried every day since their disappearance. "Justice doesn't heal," he whispered once, to a reporter who asked why he came. "It just stops the bleeding. But the wound is still there." Years passed. The Bennett case became one more entry in true crime archives, another cautionary tale about the monsters hiding closest to home. Students in criminology classes studied it, pointing to the photographs, the barn, the oil drum, the silence. But for those who had lived it, the story was never over. On the anniversary of Laura and Chloe's disappearance, candles still flickered along Route 89. Friends and strangers alike gathered at the stretch of desert where the hazard lights once blinked into nothingness. They spoke Laura and Chloe's names. They whispered promises that they would never be forgotten. And as the wind swept across the mesas, carrying the echoes of voices and prayers, some swore it felt like the desert itself was listening, remembering. Charles Whitaker may have taken their lives, but he hadn't erased their presence. In the silence he left behind, Laura and Chloe still lived, in memory, in grief, in love that refused to be buried. And yet, the unease remained, because the question that lingered wasn't just how Charles could have done it. It was this: how many others walk among us, hidden in plain sight, carrying shadows in their hearts, until the day those shadows break free?